The arrival of the Spanish in the Americas and their subsequent conquest of vast territories was a historical process that forever changed the fate of humanity. It was a military, political, and cultural feat that, despite being extraordinary in terms of exploration and expansion, was marked by violence, exploitation, and the clash of civilizations. To fully understand it, we must analyze the early voyages of exploration, the great campaigns of conquest, and the profound consequences that followed Spain's establishment of dominance in Latin America. Everything began with Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 when, financed by the Catholic monarchs of Spain, he set out on an expedition to find a new route to the Indies. During his Atlantic journey, Columbus arrived at what we now know as the Americas, specifically the Caribbean islands, although he believed he had reached a region near Asia. His return to Spain with stories of lands rich in resources sparked the interest of the crown and numerous adventurers eager to explore and conquer these new territories. From that point on, multiple expeditions were organized, marking the beginning of the conquest process. One of the most striking episodes of this expansion was the conquest of Mexico. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, an ambitious Spanish nobleman, landed on the coast of present-day Mexico with a small army of approximately 600 soldiers, 16 horses, and a few pieces of artillery. From the outset, Cortés understood that he could not confront the powerful Aztec Empire alone, as it controlled vast territories and subjugated numerous tribes. Strategically, he allied with the Tlaxcaltecas and other indigenous groups that resented Aztec rule. This alliance was crucial to his campaign, as it allowed him to significantly increase his army with thousands of indigenous warriors willing to fight against the Aztecs. When Cortés and his men arrived in Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire built on a lake, they were received by Emperor Moctezuma II, who initially believed that the Spaniards might be divine envoys, a belief reinforced by the legend of Quetzalcoatl, a god who, according to mythology, would one day return. However, Moctezuma's apparent hospitality did not prevent the Spaniards from soon seizing control of the city and taking the emperor prisoner. Tensions escalated and finally erupted in 1520 with a great Aztec uprising. In what is known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spaniards were expelled from Tenochtitlan, suffering heavy losses while trying to escape, with many drowning in the city's canals due to the weight of the gold they attempted to carry with them. Far from surrendering, Cortés regrouped, reinforced his troops with more indigenous allies, and, in 1521, launched a siege on Tenochtitlan. The battle was brutal, and after months of fighting, the city fell into Spanish hands. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was complete, and on its ruins, the Spaniards began building what would later become Mexico City. Meanwhile, in South America, another Spanish conqueror, Francisco Pizarro, led the campaign against the Inca Empire, which at the time was the most powerful in the Andean region. Unlike Cortés, Pizarro had even fewer men, only about 180 soldiers, 27 horses, and a few firearms. However, his arrival in 1532 coincided with a moment of great instability within the empire, as the Incas were embroiled in a civil war between brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar, who were fighting for the throne after their father's death. Pizarro took advantage of this situation and, through deception and false promises, managed to capture Atahualpa in the city of Cajamarca. Despite the Inca offering a massive ransom in gold and silver for his release, the Spaniards executed him in 1533. Without a strong leader, the Inca Empire quickly weakened and resistance was suppressed. In 1533, the Spaniards took Cuzco, the Incan capital, consolidating their control over the Andes. These victories marked the beginning of Spanish dominance in the Americas, which quickly expanded throughout the continent. However, the conquest was not just about territorial expansion. It also brought profound changes to indigenous societies. One of the most tragic aspects of the conquest was the demographic impact on the indigenous population. Diseases brought by Europeans, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, devastated millions who had no immunity to these viruses. In some regions, up to 90% of the indigenous population perished within a few decades, leading to an unprecedented social collapse. Additionally, the Spaniards imposed exploitative labor systems like the encomienda, which forced indigenous people to work for Spanish colonizers under extremely harsh conditions, especially in the silver and gold mines. Another significant effect of the conquest was cultural and racial mestizage, mixing. The arrival of the Spaniards introduced not only a new political and economic structure, but also a fusion of customs, languages, and beliefs. Christianity was imposed as the dominant religion, and many indigenous practices were banned, though in many cases, a religious syncretism emerged in which native traditions blended with Catholicism. The Spanish language became the primary tongue, although many indigenous languages survived and continue to be spoken today. The conquest also transformed global trade. The Americas became the primary source of precious metals for Spain, especially with the exploitation of mines like Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. The wealth extracted from the Americas financed the growth of the Spanish Empire and altered the global economy, paving the way for what we now know as the modern capitalist system. However, indigenous resistance never completely disappeared. Although the great empires fell, many regions saw revolts and wars for centuries. In places like Chile, the Mapuche fiercely resisted Spanish rule for over 300 years. Other indigenous leaders, such as Tupac Amaru II in the 18th century, attempted to regain independence for their people, although their uprisings were brutally suppressed. In conclusion, the conquest of the Americas was one of the most profound transformations in history. In a relatively short period, the Spaniards managed to dominate vast territories, but the human and cultural cost was enormous. The continent that emerged from this process was a new world, marked by the blending of civilizations, colonial oppression, and indigenous resistance. Its effects are still felt today in the identity, culture, and history of Latin American countries, where the legacy of the conquest remains a topic of debate and reflection.